Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
The Jobs Friday edition and a Jobs Friday market that we are all experiencing, as Charlie was just running us through, because it was indeed a hot payrolls print we got today. Actually, one that our economists here at Bloomberg Economics might have predicted. They thought this was going to come in higher than the consensus call. And indeed, 177,000 job additions in the month of March is what we got, something the White House is touting. Stephen Myron, who chairs the Council of Economic Advisors over there, joined Bloomberg earlier today.
There's been an ongoing disconnect between the hard data and the soft data, and the hard data continued to perform very well. 177,000 jobs last month, a beat of 40,000 jobs. That's the president's second jobs day beat in a row. And on top of that, you've got 11,000 construction jobs, expanding construction sector in spite of the president's crackdown on the border.
So there you have it. Non-farm payrolls increasing by 177,000 last month. And nobody came closer than Anna Wong, who joins us right now, Bloomberg Economics chief U.S. economist. Anna, it's great to see you. The headlines all seem to read the same. Hotter than expected despite uncertainty over tariffs. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, so we basically predicted this, right? But I also said in our preview that this would be the last solid print before we are about to have two very weak print. And even this solid print surprised me in some details on how weak certain things are. So I'll tell you, Joe, the thing that surprised me was that the gains in professional and businesses sector, which is what we expected, actually largely came from employment services. So basically, employment services are the people who are helping temp agencies, helping people who are jobless to get temp jobs. So essentially, the support to payrolls print today is due to an increase in demand of jobs of helping jobless people.
Okay, well, that is definitely important to consider as we look at the kind of breakdown here. There's also the fact that manufacturing was not seeing job expansion. Instead, those jobs went down by about 1,000 last month. What does that signal, Anna? Because we've talked about how it's manufacturers that actually have felt the effects of these tariffs largely first.
Yes. So any economic models would predict that the indicators that would be showing the earliest evidence of the impact of tariff would be ISM manufacturing, and we did see it today. I mean, this week, that in the survey it indicates that firms are resorting to layoffs now. So that's why we have seen a negative change in payrolls today for manufacturing sectors. In the coming two payrolls report, we're expecting a significant slowdown in logistics and trade sector. And usually, basically, in May and in June and July, you're supposed to see a bustling of activity in the ports because firms are very busy getting the shipments off the boats, transporting those goods that are about to stock up the shelf in Home Depot for ahead of Halloween, and Target for getting back to school. All those are supposed to be arriving at the ports in May and June. And we are not going to see that because of the disruption we are already seeing. There are only 35 ships leaving China for U.S. as of 2 days ago. Nothing could change that. Wow. Even if there's a 100% pivot in tariff today, we are still not going to see the goods in the ports in the first 2 weeks of May.
Fascinating. We heard from Elon Musk this week talking about the efforts of the Doge or the accomplishments of the Doge. Of course, the original intention was to find $2 trillion in cuts. They got to $160 billion, he said. Also put a number on job cuts. 1% of the federal workforce, 20,000 people. Does a number like that have an impact in the jobs data, or is that much smaller than some people expected, and it's a blip on the radar?
Yeah, so 150 billion, if we take that number at face value, is basically where our baseline was. Even I remember Scott Bessent 2 months ago when he did an interview with Bloomberg here with Saleha, our reporter Saleha, he said that it would be already a cherry on a cake to have 200 billion cut. So that is something. And also, in terms of the reduction in federal workforce, Joe, remember that the key piece is actually the hiring freeze. Every year, about 120,000 to 150,000 federal workers retire or just naturally go through attrition. And so by not refilling replacing those jobs, you're actually slowly downsizing the federal government workforce. And by 2028, at the end of this Trump administration, the federal workforce would be maybe at least 6 to 10% smaller than when it began.
Wow.
Well, of course, we have a long way to go until we get to 2028.
Yes, indeed.
Just judging by how 2025 has gone so far, probably it's going to feel like a lot more than just 4 years. Anna, finally on the data today, when we consider that we actually had cooler wage growth than expected, knowing we've had this ongoing conversation about, what's going to happen if the Fed is faced with both inflationary and growth risk at the same time? What do they do? Does that actually suggest that some of those inflationary pressures you might be worried about are not present, at least right now?
Yeah, so keep in mind that our team has been saying that the core PCE inflation would not be as high as what the consensus is saying and what the Fed is projecting, because precisely for that reason, Kailey, we think that the service sector, which is more important for the U.S. economy, it accounts for about 70% of CPI basket, that part of the economy is going to soften, and as a result, the disinflationary pressure from the services will offset some of the goods price inflation that we might be seeing. So on net, we just don't think that the tariff shock will ultimately lead to a 3.5 to 4.0 core PCE inflation that internal Fed forecast might be showing.
All right. Of course, we'll be hearing from the Fed on Wednesday. Wonder how that data will factor into the fact that they're very likely to not do anything with rates next week. Anna Wong of Bloomberg Economics joining us on this Jobs Day. Thank you so much. And we want to continue the conversation now as we turn to Catherine Edwards, who's an economic policy consultant and a contributor to Bloomberg Opinion, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Catherine, welcome back. I wonder your reading of the jobs report today, knowing we've been talking to you for months now about concern you have around what could be a deterioration in the labor market. Doesn't look like we're seeing that much evidence of it yet.
No, I would call this a muted, if not boring, jobs report. I mean, we're all looking through it with a fine-tooth comb, but there's really not that much there. And I think it's expected, given the timing of the bigger tariff announcements. The data is collected just in the second week of the month, so it would have been pretty radical for the tariffs to have affected the labor market so quickly and so intangibly. The way that the mechanisms of a tariff affecting the labor market, are pretty well understood, but they don't happen as fast as a week and a half from an announcement.
So what's your trajectory then for the job market? We just got a GDP showing contraction in the first quarter. We're seeing recession odds go up. Some suggest we're in a recession already. Once we work through the next couple of months, the impact of tariff uncertainty, the federal worker layoffs that we were just discussing with Anna, and a broader slowdown economically means what for this job market?
I went through the Beige Book that was reported in April to hear what the Federal Reserve regional branches are hearing from employers in their districts. And you'll see kind of throughout the report, not starting layoffs, but making preparation for reductions in headcount. Right? They have not felt the need to cut their jobs, but they are preparing for a headcount reduction. And this definitely dovetails with what we are seeing in consumer sentiment. Now, it's very easy for people to kind of dismiss consumer sentiment of like, this is just the histrionics of people, it's driven by politics, but there's really good economic research behind the tangible aspect of consumer sentiment is people who have information that has not manifested in the economy yet. So this would be something like your boss tells you your job's going to end in June. You still have a job, but something bad is coming. Or they tell you if more ships don't leave China and these ports aren't busy, all of you are furloughed by May or by end of May, right? There is a sense in which consumer sentiment reflects information that people have about where the economy is going. And this is why it can tank kind of leading up to and is considered a leading recession indicator. I think that those two things combined, they're worrisome. And we still haven't seen an uptick in hiring. We still haven't seen employers really expanding payrolls to a great degree. And one thing that Anna didn't mention is that about a third of job growth entirely this year comes from the health sector, which is not a reflection of economic activity.
Well,
Or the
that's a good
strength
point.
of the economy, rather.
Sure. When you were referring to the idea that ships aren't necessarily going to be coming in from China, we heard from President Trump when he was at the meeting of his cabinet earlier this week talking about dolls, that maybe children will only have 2 dolls instead of 30. And maybe those dolls will cost a few dollars more. And I wonder if you see that as recognition of an economic reality on the part of President Trump that to this point he has seemed reluctant to adopt or acknowledge.
I mean, I think that this is another flip-flop from someone who changes his mind all the time. I mean, remember that we had in January and February kind of dismissive concerns that economic pain was necessary. And then we had, following in March and April that the Fed just needs to cooperate with him. And so now we're not going to have pain, but we will have fewer dolls. I mean, I think it's just a lack of consistency that we've seen top to bottom with these tariffs. I mean, think about what was put on a placard in the Rose Garden that didn't apply with even in 2 weeks. Or how deliberate were the numbers that went up on a placard in the Rose Garden that the internet tore it apart really in under an hour, that it wasn't really reflective of actual economic realities or the relationships we have in terms of trade with other countries. So I think there is a part of economic uncertainty that is hard to place that comes from a distrust of leadership. So we can negotiate trade agreements, we can get things back on board, but I don't know how many businesses think that there is going to be consistent economic policy or messaging coming from the White House.
Did Donald Trump just recognize reality, though, Catherine? What will this mean when it comes to back to school shopping? This is going to be a massive story late summer going into fall. And then there's going to be the story about Christmas being canceled, right? Is there any way to turn this around?
Of course, like you should never give up on the U.S. economy, and you should never give up on good policy being able to make a difference. I think that many people are scared, and I know that the stock market is on a winning streak, and that's great. But the terror that is inflicted on savers when they see their 401k take a nosedive, that doesn't bounce back as much as the S&P does within a couple of weeks. There is a real fear and vulnerability that goes into consumer thinking. And if you hear from your boss, we might have to do layoffs in the summer, and you look at your 401k balance at the wrong week in April and you get scared about the future, you're not going to spend money the same way. It's possible to turn mood and sentiment around, but telling people fewer dolls is in their future is probably not the way to do it.
Well, and if we consider what the implication of a slowdown in consumption would be, knowing that consumers are the engine of the U.S. economy, Catherine, that's where all of this kind of recessionary talk comes in. Even the president has said he thinks that there could be an economic slowdown if the Fed does not cut rates in time. A repeated suggestion that the Fed risks being too late here, as they have in the president's mind been in the past. And I wonder if you actually think there is some truth to that notion that the Fed is likely to be late to react just by the function of monetary policy and the lag with which it works.
The Fed, doesn't serve one master but the U.S. economy. And they've got to act within the stewardship of the U.S. economy, providing stability and certainty going forward. And, if the president says jump and Powell says how high, that is even worse case scenario than a recession. And that's a permanent hit to our economy and stability. So we have to trust the Fed to put all of the data on the table and have a broad-based decision making that isn't just about, intervening during a time of uncertainty. And, frankly, like, what the U.S. economy needs is stability and certainty. And so I think that this is what has made the tariff rollout so doubly dangerous, because as you mentioned, Kailey, there is a certain degree to which recessions become self-fulfilling, that as people get more scared, they pull back on spending, that declines economic activity because they're the engine of economic growth, and that accelerates a decline, as we're rolling down the hill. And so I think Powell being stayed here is really the antidote for a lot of people's fears, to the extent that they, pay attention as much as understanding the Fed's role in the economy, which could be a leap for a lot of people. But, I think as, people like us who are in deep on following what is going on in the details of the economy, it is nice to see Powell putting data in the economy first.
Well, it's great to have you back, Catherine. Economic policy consultant, Bloomberg opinion contributor Catherine Edwards with her view on the economy, just days away from the next Fed meeting. He's got his work cut out for him next week, Kailey. Jay Powell's going to face questions about tariffs and Trump, and you wonder if he brings any nuances that we haven't heard yet to this conversation.
Yeah, of course, we've already heard repeatedly from him. The Fed operates independently.
Yeah.
That independence is protected by law. They feel that they have the flexibility here to wait and see. There's too much policy uncertainty. He's probably not going to signal, hey, I'm thinking about cutting rates anytime soon.
You don't even need to watch it now. Just listen to Kailey. Mick Mulvaney's on the way in.
Yeah, it's
we
been a
haven't
while.
talked to Mick in some time. He'll join us next with the view from the Republican Party, our Trump whisperer on the way in here as Donald Trump spends the weekend at Mar-a-Lago. We'll have much more straight ahead on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
With a look at the Friday trade, what could be the best rally, or closing the best 9-day rally we've seen on the S&P 500, the first time we've seen a 9-day rally like that, going back to 2004 as we could consider jobs and trade. And I wonder, there's a question as to whether or not the market is also discounting the focus now being on tax cuts that could be coming down the line as Congress is still working on its budget reconciliation package, though, of course, they're not in town today. It's Friday. Why would they be? They're going to come back next week, though. And the House particularly is going to keep working, though. It's interesting. They actually have decided to punt on the markups in some key committees of their pieces of legislation. The Energy and Commerce Committee, which is still dealing with a massive question around Medicaid. The Ways and Means Committee, which actually has to be the architect of this tax package. What's going to be included? Potentially a lifting of the SALT cap. Are they going to really not tax overtime tips or Social Security and all of those various components? So there still is a lot of work to do, but President Trump, at least yesterday in the White House Rose Garden, was sounding optimistic because he still wants to see this one big package come to fruition.
The progress of the one big, beautiful bill, we love that bill. I won't like it if it doesn't pass, neither will you. It doesn't pass, your taxes are going to go up 68%. These will be the biggest tax cuts in American history, with 100% expensing, which is something that people cannot believe they're getting. We did it in the last one, and we had the most successful economy in my first 4 years that we've ever had in the history of our country.
Which brings us to our conversation with Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff, former Republican congressman who helped to found the Freedom Caucus, and a former OMB director is with us now. It's been a long time. Mick, welcome back. Great to see you. You're no stranger to this process or the President of the United States. And so I want to pick up on what Kailey mentioned, the delayed markups for energy and commerce, ways and means, agriculture. At some point, they're going to have to get to this. And the matter of Medicaid has people in a bind. The president says there will be no cuts. Speaker says we're not going to do it. There are members of your former Freedom Caucus who want to see dramatic cuts. But if we hold the line on this and make good on what Donald Trump is saying, there will be no cuts to Medicare or Medicaid. Where do you find the money?
Hello and happy Friday. Nice to see you guys working on a Friday. Kailey, you're getting a little bit cynical about Washington, D.C. Look, keep in mind that, and I had this conversation with, there's a lot of questions wrapped up. Let me take the last one about Medicare and Medicaid. When Donald Trump says there's been no cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, I've had that conversation personally with Donald Trump a dozen times. And when he said, Mick, you can't cut Medicare in our 2018 budget, for example, I said, Mr. President, what is Medicare to you? He said, well, Medicare is what people get when they turn to the health care they get when they're 65. I said, you're absolutely right. And I'm not going to touch that. Can I please have your permission to go and look at reducing spending or reforming everything else that falls under Medicare that people don't know about and most people don't care about? He said, what do you mean? I said, I ran down the 15 different programs that are funded out of this giant pot of money. That Medicare, he said, that's not Medicare. I said, Mr. President, technically it is. He goes, good, fix that. Our budget in 2018 was the largest entitlement reform proposal in history, but did not touch the over 65 healthcare benefits and did not touch old age income supplements for Social Security. But it still cut Social Security, reform Medicare, those types of things. So you have to watch the language. The bottom line, though, to your point, Joe, is great. It's hard. It's really, really hard. When we did that in the budget in 2018, the people who hated it the most were Republicans in the Senate. And that hasn't changed. It's really, really, really hard to cut spending. In fact, it's really hard to slow the growth of spending in Washington. So that's why you're seeing these meetings these markups get canceled, because they don't know how to do it.
Well, as we consider spending, we should also note that the president and the White House released their so-called skinny budget today, Mick, in which the president is proposing base non-defense discretionary budget authority of $163 billion. That is nearly 23% below current year spending. Is there any real chance of that becoming reality?
No, not really. In fact, behind me, someplace over there on the wall, is the Wall Street Journal cover story when we did the exact same thing in 2018. I think it was the same, almost. I called Russ today and I was giving him the thumbs up, because I think that's the same percentage reduction in non-defense discretionary spending that we had, that he and I did it together in 2018. No, it doesn't have a chance. It has more of a chance now than it did in 2018, because Donald Trump has more control over his own party. But while there was, more than half of the Republicans on the Hill hated it back in 2018, maybe still 15% of them hate it now, and you can't lose 15% of the vote. So look, the way that compromises get done in Washington, D.C. is that you spend more, not less. And my guess is that's what they're going to end up doing in some fashion. They'll figure out a way to call it a reduction in spending. But look, Russ Vogt doesn't get a vote on how Congress spends money, and Congress is going to want to spend more money.
Does the president care about this? We talk a lot about deficit reduction, and then we go ahead and pass a bill with trillions of dollars in deficit spending. It kind of looks like that's where we're going.
I think he cares, but he cares more about getting the tax bill extended. And I think right now, if he came to him and said, look, Mr. President, we have to cut spending in order to get the tax bill passed, he would say, I am now the biggest fan of cutting spending. If you came to him and said, Mr. President, we're going to have to raise taxes on the super wealthy in order to pass your tax bill, he's going to be the biggest fan of raising taxes on the super wealthy. He wants the bill passed. But here's the part, and you guys mentioned this in the run-up, and I don't think this is getting nearly enough attention. The bill is not a tax cut. The bill is an extension of the current tax rates. It's the prevention of a tax increase. And I know that sounds like it's a semantic difference, but it's not. If you are an ordinary middle-class American and you hear Donald Trump go on TV and say, I'm going to give you a huge tax cut, technically he's correct, because the current law is that your taxes are going to go up, and he's preventing that from happening. But if you were expecting more money in your wallet, if this bill passes, you are going to be extraordinarily disappointed. And that's going to be a hard sell for the Republicans.
Well, and is it an even harder sell, because it is not just being pitched as a tax cut, but something that's going to offset potentially the detrimental impact of the tariff policy? They say this is a 1-2 punch. You got to wait for the tax portion as you consider what this is going to do overall economically. But Mick, you're suggesting that there's not going to be that much juice in this.
Yeah, there's going to be a little juice, because a couple of things have already phased out. I think the 100% expensing that we did in the 2017 Act has slowly wound down, and resetting that to 100% is going to help. It's certainly help on business investment and so forth, and ultimately help with economic growth. But again, if you are an ordinary person trying to figure out if you have enough money to buy toys for Christmas, and you're counting on that big, beautiful bill, that's not going to help you. You are not going to have more money in your pocket in order to pay for the higher expenses, the things that cost more because of tariffs. And that's where I think the Republicans have got a blind spot, especially in terms of a PR message.
Where's Donald Trump on tariffs? Mick, so many people think they can get inside the president's head on this. It's become a question about whether tariffs are a negotiating tool or a way to raise revenue. There is a group, though, and there are many Republicans who tell us off the air, Donald Trump never intended to have a new tariff policy in place. This is, in fact, leverage that he's using. In a couple of months down the road, we're not even going to be talking about this anymore. Wall Street seems to be maybe warming up to that idea. We've just round trip back to where we were before so-called Liberation Day. Bring us inside his head when it comes to tariffs.
Yeah, of course, that's been the $64,000 question since Liberation Day. Are they the Peter Navarro tariffs, which are tariffs for the sake of tariffs, staying forever as a way to sort of encourage domestic production of textiles again? or are they tariffs, for the sake of leverage on getting better trade deals? No, I'm sorry. And I think what we know now is it's the latter. It's the more nuanced approach that Scott Bessent has been pushing. I don't think they're going away, but I don't think Peter Navarro is having nearly the voice in the White House that he's had the last couple of months.
Well, someone who's a voice within the White House or Trump's inner circle is going to change. We learned yesterday, Mick, is Mike Waltz, who's no longer national security advisor, has now become the nominee to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. You obviously served in the first Trump administration. You were familiar with the kind of turnover nature of it. It's how you ended up at one point being acting White House chief of staff. And I wonder what your reaction was to yesterday's news that President Trump wasn't necessarily letting him go. He's not getting fired, simply maybe being reassigned. But still, this is the first shakeup we have seen in term 2.
It is, and I got a different perspective on it than I think most people. Look, I think I like Mike Waltz. I think they'll be hurt by having Mike Waltz's influence not available to them in the White House. I know who's in charge of immigration policy in the White House. That's Stephen Miller. I know who's in charge of leading the discussion on spending. That's Russ Vought. I sort of had the impression that Mike Waltz was at least a leading voice on foreign policy in the White House, and now he'll be gone. Okay. And I think that hurts the White House. There's no question. Losing the talent like Mike Waltz hurts. But here's the part I think they're missing. They've nominated him for a Senate-confirmed position. I consider the UN ambassadorship to be a demotion. I think most people would. John Bolton didn't go from NSC, National Security Advisor, to UN ambassador. He went the other way. Nikki Haley would not have gone down. She would have only gone up. But it is Senate confirmed. What does that mean? The Democrats are going to get the investigation into so-called Signalgate that they haven't been able to get up to this point. And we are going to be hearing about this for a long time. I think Mike Waltz is ultimately confirmed for this position. I just wonder if we don't go through an entire summertime of drip, drip, drip of leaks about Signalgate that somehow get collateral damage, most specifically Hegseth at Defense.
It seems like we are. We talked to Senator Chris Coons about this last evening, and they're already preparing for those hearings. Mick, we're out of time. I've only got 30 seconds left. Can he still be confirmed? Will he clear committee?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, he's qualified. He'll clear committee. It was a mistake. There's no question. It was a stupid mistake. It was a mistake that rightly cost him his job, but the man is eminently qualified for the position. I think he'll be confirmed.
All right, Mick Mulvaney, great to have you back here on Balance of Power. Former acting White House chief of staff in the first Trump administration, former OMB director, former Republican congressman from South Carolina, founder of the House Freedom Caucus.
You got them all. I think you got them all.
Okay, it is a long resume. Joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and we still have much more ahead. Our conversation with Democratic Congresswoman and New Jersey gubernatorial candidate Mikey Sherrill is just ahead on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
The first real turnover, or at least shaking up, of the second Trump administration as he announced that his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, who of course was embroiled in the Signalgate scandal after his inadvertent addition of a journalist to a chat that discussed Houthi attack plans, is now the nominee to be ambassador to the United Nations, leading many to question the other person who was operative in that Signalgate scandal, the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who actually texted the plans of the fighter jets, the weapons that would be used to strike the Houthis, and what would happen to him. And it's something we had a chance to ask Mikey Sherrill about earlier. She's a Democratic congresswoman from New Jersey, also gubernatorial candidate in New Jersey, and happens to be a former Navy helicopter pilot and sit on the Armed Services Committee. And this is what she said when we asked about the defense secretary.
Pete Hegseth needs to be fired. He is somebody that has obviously given classified information out over Signal, which is not a classified platform. And almost inexplicably, he wasn't just on that text chain we're all aware of with Mike Waltz. He was also on a separate text chain with his wife and his brother, among other people. So this is an infraction that would get a junior petty officer court-martialed. Certainly the Secretary of Defense needs to be fired for this.
You're backing an amendment to prevent the Secretary of Defense from destroying records and historical artifacts at the Pentagon and in our service academies. Congresswoman, you said in a recent Armed Services Committee meeting that he's taken Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou off library shelves, but left 2 copies of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Does this amendment have the support to pass?
Unfortunately, we did not see that support in the House Armed Services hearing that we held on it. Again, this does not seem controversial to me. This erasure of history of the service, particularly of Black service members and women, is an affront. I went to the Naval Academy. I served for almost 10 years as a helicopter pilot, as a Russian policy officer. And I will tell you, the idea that somehow service women should not be there is just infuriating when we have seen such brave and great service from so many women, like our former CNO, who was one of the first admirals fired by this administration, and others. So at this point, I am just really convinced that Pete Hegseth is a real cancer on the military and certainly needs to be fired.
As we consider the defense posture of the United States, Congresswoman, President Trump today is requesting a record $1 trillion national security budget. Is that level of spending justified in the next fiscal year?
Well, I don't think we saw the $150 billion supplemental well justified because we didn't have the safeguards in place as to where it would go. We, in the hearing, tried to make sure that we understood exactly what was being funded. There wasn't a lot of clarity, and there weren't enough guardrails. So simply dumping $150 billion, much less $1 trillion, onto this Pentagon, when we have a Secretary of Defense that has proven to be very incompetent, many of the top leaders having resigned. At this point, we don't have a new chief of naval operations. I'm not sure anybody at this point wants that job because of the chaos that we're seeing at the top in the Pentagon. So we really, I think, have a lot of concerns. I have a lot of concerns as a member of the House Armed Services Committee about what the proposals are in this budget and what they will be funding.
Well, it becomes a question as well of what it is we're spending this money on, regardless of the spending level. Congresswoman, I know this is a debate that you're involved in on armed services. There was reporting recently that Elon Musk actually advised Secretary Hegseth on procurement, that we should be spending less money on the weapon systems and platforms of the Cold War and investing more in drones and hypersonic missiles. Is he right?
I think that there's some truth in there. I think what we saw, especially as we watched Ukraine, we saw how important some of these drones and new technologies are. I think the procurement process at the Pentagon is something that I've been very concerned about for years, and I think we can do a lot better. My concern, though, with somebody like Elon Musk advising this is the debacle that he's created with the DOGE process, which has not been thoughtful at all, which has actually fired a lot of people that are critical to the running of our country, people like air traffic controllers or people at the FDA or the NIH. So I would be very concerned about having Elon Musk run this process. And that's why at the hearing we just had in Armed Services, we wanted to understand what DOGE was doing in the military. We've got no clarity on that, which is just once again related to my concerns about what's going on in the Pentagon, especially under Secretary Hegseth.
Congresswoman, I'd like to ask you as well about the budget reconciliation process that is well underway on Capitol Hill, though it is kind of one party only. Democrats don't really seem to be playing a role here. But I wonder, when you consider your constituents at home in New Jersey, if you still think they might actually be net beneficiaries of this ultimate tax package, if it is to include a lifting of the SALT cap.
I think overall they will probably lose out because what we're seeing is a $6 trillion addition to the deficit, higher than anything we saw under the Inflation Reduction Act or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CARES Act combined. And in fact, this huge increase of the deficit while at the same time not funding some of the really basic priorities of our state. 1 in 3 children use Medicaid as their insurance. Many of our nursing homes use Medicaid to care for people at the end of their life. Many families are relying on that nursing home care for their loved ones. So we also see these hits to the Department of Education and the Title I funding, a lot of funding that goes to the disabled community. I hear from that community quite often about what the future holds for them. And then at the same time, beyond just what we're seeing in reconciliation, we're seeing these huge hits to the economy of New Jersey that are ongoing because of the tariff regime and the chaos coming out of Washington. So I'm hearing from everyone from a coffee shop in my town saying costs are going to go up, to a builder in my area who's saying I've stopped all my projects because HVAC systems are going up 30 to 40%. And then as concerning, we're seeing the world community is becoming really infuriated by the destabilization of the world economy by the United States. So we're hearing Canadian tourists are not going to come down the shore this summer, which is going to be a huge hit to our economy. We're also hearing from, manufacturers that I was talking to one manufacturer saying, look, I had these orders from Germany. They just called me to cancel the orders to say they're not buying American anymore. So I'm not just concerned about the short-term consequences here, but some of the long-term consequences that we're seeing on the ground in New Jersey.
Well, we've spent the better part of this conversation talking about the changing political realities here in Washington. And of course, there are national implications. If you become the next governor of New Jersey, to what extent will you be able to balance what's coming from Washington in the state of New Jersey? Or is this Donald Trump's world?
No, this is why I'm running for governor, because I think we can take a very different path forward in New Jersey. We have so much opportunity in this state. I think building houses so we can drive down housing costs, making sure we're planning for utilities, because I firmly believe that the state that can drive down utility costs and produce the power of the future while driving down carbon emissions is the state that is going to own the innovation of the future. Investing in our broken healthcare system and rethinking how we're delivering care to millions of people. I think there is such an incredible amount of opportunity here to show a different and distinct path away from what we see coming out of Washington. What we see is the attacks on the economy and the attacks on opportunity, the attacks on just rights and freedom coming from Washington, D.C., standing in the breach as New Jersey with a different path forward, which I think is going to be really compelling.
Fascinating conversation with the Congresswoman, also a gubernatorial candidate, as you just heard.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Quite the rise in the markets here following that headline of less than an hour ago coming from the Wall Street Journal about an overture from Beijing when it comes to trade, one of the president's most important issues, not just trade and tariffs, but also fentanyl, maybe an off-ramp here from China, according to the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street is not waiting around to find out with new highs for the day. With us now, a little bit earlier than usual, is my partner, Kailey Leinz, here on Balance of Power for an important conversation that we're going to have with Mallory McMorrow. It's been an interesting day here in news, though, coming off the data this morning, the news from China. Maybe we'll get some more clarity on this. I think it was Kevin Hassett yesterday who said there was trade news coming. We didn't get it yesterday, but that doesn't mean it can't happen on Friday.
Yeah, so they keep us waiting. And of course, this news from the Journal comes after the Chinese Ministry of Commerce signaled that it is evaluating whether or not to open talks with the United States on trade overall. But the fact that this reporting suggests they're looking at fentanyl specifically speaks to the very myriad range of issues that the U.S. is using tariffs to address with China. It is not just about their overcapacity in terms of supplying the the global markets and what he sees as a way too large trade deficit. It's also about things like fentanyl. And as we always have, it's a question of how much tariffs are intended to address those issues, or how much it is about onshoring U.S. manufacturing, benefiting American workers, because that was the argument, of course, he was making as he celebrated 100 days in office in Michigan last week.
That's right. Well, it brings us to the dichotomy that we were talking about a little bit earlier this hour. And Michigan is a great example of that when it comes to auto tariffs, for instance. In the C-suites, and we've heard from Mary Barra, we've heard from the executives at all of the major U.S. automakers. Jim Farley certainly had strong feelings about tariffs. This is a massive disruption in their supply chains and potentially in their business. They're pulling guidance. But when you talk to auto workers on the manufacturing floor, they love this idea. And many of them voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's right. Sean Fain, who leads the United Auto Workers, has been wholly supportive of the idea of auto tariffs specifically. And it becomes a question of, is it something that is different for the companies than it is for the workers who are actually putting together these cars? And of course, that is a key constituency in states like Michigan. Well,
this is the backdrop for our conversation that we've been looking forward to and telling you about. Mallory McMorrow is with us, Democratic Michigan state senator, and now a candidate for U.S. Senate, having been framed repeatedly as a rising star in the Democratic Party. Mallory McMorrow, welcome to Bloomberg. It's great to have you with us. As we have this conversation about trade and tariffs specific to Michigan, just want to ask you more broadly. This past election saw Michigan elect Elissa Slotkin and Donald Trump on the same ballot. When we consider the message that you're honing now as a new generation on the campaign trail, what is it that national Democrats misunderstand about your state?
Michiganders are fiercely independent, and it's so great to be with both of you to share a little bit more of why. You know, this is a state that in the 1980s had 5 of the top 10 metro regions in the entire country for median household income. So this idea, this vision of Make America Great Again, I think was compelling to a lot of Michiganders who remember vividly when we were the most prosperous state in the country. And there is a longing to recapture that prosperity. And the question is how? So I think that is a reason why many Michiganders may have voted for Donald Trump, but also see the appeal in somebody like Elissa Slotkin, somebody who is no BS. She will tell it to you straight. She brings a strong national security background with her work in the CIA. And I think a lot of Michiganders respect the fact that Elissa served under both Presidents Bush and Obama in a moment where we see nothing but division. People want to see their elected leaders work together. So my campaign is really centered on this idea of making a new American dream, acknowledging that we can't recreate the prosperity of our past by going backwards, and leaning into my own story. I'm a millennial who graduated right into the recession. I had no job prospects. I had no health insurance. I lived in the back of my car for a few nights, applied to 300 jobs, and I talked to Michiganders across this state who share that sentiment and frustration of having done everything right and still feeling like they're behind and they're not getting ahead and they don't have stability. So this is going to be about 3 things: success, safety, and sanity, and writing that new American dream together in a way that people can see themselves in, that isn't just about Donald Trump. It's not about, relitigating what he's doing or not doing. It's about what our future looks like.
Well, and we do want to get into the fact that you are a millennial and kind of the generational question now at play with the Democratic Party and what you might represent. But to touch back on your point around prosperity and what it will take to return it, for those who were gathered at the rally in Macomb County earlier this week, as Donald Trump talked about the Reagan Democrats and the auto workers who he thinks his policies will benefit, what is your message to that particular part of Michigan's constituency that you are seeking to represent, who feel like these policies actually would serve to benefit them?
There is a world where a thoughtful trade policy, thoughtful tariff policy could do things like bring a 3rd or 4th shift back on some of our manufacturing facilities that have laid workers off or have idled. But what we're seeing now is the broad, expansive tariffs that went on after the announcement of the auto tariffs on everyday goods, from clothes to coffee to bananas to diapers, is going to devastate workers. So the approach that I have, that I hope Michiganders hear, is that we have to be thoughtful as we put policy forward and not have this approach that I think we've seen out of the Trump administration of ready, fire, aim, of let's just announce things, see how they go. And I think Michigan, really for the rest of the country, is a canary in the coal mine. We saw some strong jobs numbers come out this morning. However, Michigan has the second highest increase in unemployment in the entire country. Our unemployment rate is sitting right now around 5.5%. We've seen layoffs at Stellantis, at suppliers, at small business owners, and we see that ripple effect play out where, over in Long Beach, the longshoremen put out a really critical, strong letter about the impact that this is going to have to jobs in the economy if we don't see some measuring in the approach to tariff policy. So I am heartened by some of the news out of Beijing that you just mentioned, but we're going to have to see some stability and not the chaos that we've seen so far.
There's a question about whether to engage right now. James Carville would say Democrats should hibernate, give Trump the rope. Governor Gretchen Whitmer was criticized, as I'm sure you saw, by a lot of Democrats for coming to Washington to meet with President Trump. There was a bit of an awkward Oval Office appearance, but then days later we learned the Selfridge Air Base would get a new fighter wing, which she lobbied for. So is your governor actually the smartest one in the room?
I think what people want to see right now is that not only how to fight, but when to fight and when not to fight. Governor Whitmer is in one of the most difficult positions that I think any governor is in the country. We have seen a president who is willing to carry out vengeance and retribution on governors who dare to stand up to him. We saw this with Governor Mills and Trump rescinding funding from her state. So Governor Whitmer has a track record of standing up strong against Donald Trump, but at the end of the day, she has to protect and deliver for Michiganders. So she went out to that Oval Office meeting to advocate for a new mission at Selfridge Air Force Base in Macomb County, and we saw that come to light last week. And at the end of the day, what I'm hearing from Michiganders is that they are grateful that she understands when to work with him. I think when to work against him, maybe stand up to him. She's not compromising her values. She's still a strong advocate for reproductive rights, for women's rights, for voting rights, all of the things that we need to stand up for, but also knows that, Selfridge Air Force Base delivers $880 million of economic activity in Southeast Michigan and for our state. That is essential for the success of our state. And she knew the only way we were going to get that was by meeting him, by flattering him. And she did that and did it successfully.
As you talk about values here, Mallory, and the values that do unite the Democratic Party, I think we all also know that there are plenty of fissures within the party itself, especially in the aftermath of the 2024 election. And in the contested primary in which you are competing, including against the incumbent Congresswoman Haley Stevens for that Senate seat, does that risk bringing to light some of those deep fissures? And I wonder what part of the Democratic Party you see yourself representing here.
I don't think so. One of the things that I believe has been frustrating for voters across the political spectrum is feeling like the parties are making decisions for them, that voters do not have a choice as to which their preferred candidate is. I think that was some of the frustration that I heard on the ground in 2024 from the Democratic Party. I think Vice President Harris was put in a nearly impossible situation. I think that she did an incredible job with the 100 days or so that she had to mount a campaign. But I also heard from voters who said that they really wanted to have a primary, that if President Biden was not going to seek the reelection or was unable to, that voters should decide. So I'm excited about having a primary that is going to give Michiganders the option, the ability to look at multiple candidates, look at their platforms, look at their approach. My sense in this moment, to answer the second half of your question, is that this is going to be an election decided less by where a candidate falls in the political spectrum, whether they are progressive, moderate, or somewhere in between, and more about what their approach is. And that is where I think I fit. I have been a very pragmatic legislator here in the Michigan Senate. I came into office flipping a Republican district in 2018. My predecessor had won by 14 points. I beat him by 4. So we swung a district almost 20 points in the first cycle. And I did that by appealing to a lot of voters across Oakland County who saw me and they said, "You remind me a lot of my daughter who left and went to Chicago or New York or Denver. Why are you in Michigan? And what can we do to bring my kids back?" And that is a value that I think is universal, that Michigan should be a place of opportunity and family, and that this should be a place where people want to stay, invest, start a family, buy a house. And that is the approach that I'm taking into this election, that I feel like this is less about relitigating maybe a 2016 political fight where it's the Bernie wing versus the Hillary wing, and people are looking for somebody who stands up and communicates and believes that we have a future after the Trump presidency, knows how to articulate what that is, and shows that they're willing to fight for Michiganders.
All right, Mallory, we appreciate you joining us. Mallory Morrow is a Democratic state senator in Michigan and, of course, is candidate for a Senate seat in Michigan as well. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.